This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
At 11:15 a.m. on September 3rd, 1939, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, announced to the nation that they were going to war with Germany.
Which is exactly what you're listening to right now.
I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible.
This broadcast reached millions of people. Not only was it the start of the Second World War, but it also shows how powerful radio can be to communicate not only in the UK, but around the world.
And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today.
Over the next half hour, we'll be talking about the most significant moments in radio history.
We will be talking to experts about not just radio, but also podcasting and storytelling.
And we'll also be hearing from a local radio station about the radio's impact on the community.
I'm Matthew.
I'm Gabriel.
And I'm Tristan, and this is The Rise of Radio.
So before we can even begin, we need to make something clear. We need to tell everyone listening at home what our definition of radio is, because there are so many definitions out there. So, Gabrielle, would you mind telling everyone what our definition actually is?
Yes, of course. So sometimes radio can be seen as something by itself, but sometimes it isn't. But since we are talking about other things later on, like podcasting, I would say it's the audio broadcasting industry as a whole. Like things such as audio dramas, radio, podcasts, as we've already mentioned, that sort of thing. Like anything audio-based.
Okay, thanks for making it clear. Now we can begin. Tristan, do you mind telling us a bit about how radio actually started?
Yeah, sure. Well, you might think it might be something to do with broadcasting, but it actually isn't. In a presentation in 1864, the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell proposed multiple theories of electromagnetism. His equations showed that light, radio, and X-rays are all types of electromagnetic waves. A few decades later, the German physicist Heinrich Hertz proved James's theory right. He published the results of his own experiments, where he was able to transmit electromagnetic waves, which are also known as radio waves. In doing so, he created the first wireless signal. With this new technology, it was then used to transmit signals wirelessly, mostly common use for Morse code, as it was most effective for that. However, broadcasting in the UK didn't start until the early 1920s.
To find out more, we talked to Kate Lacey, a professor of media history and theory at the University of Sussex. We first asked her how radio evolved from early wireless communication into something people could listen to at home.
That's really interesting, and it's not an inevitable story. It begins really, and if we're talking in a British context, it begins partly because of the fear of what was already happening in the United States, which was lots of individuals getting hold of radio technology and using it to send messages in a random way to each other, in a way that wasn't really controlled and wasn't a way of making money. You have to remember that in the UK, as elsewhere in Europe in particular, but also in the States, you had many thousands of soldiers coming back from the front where they'd used radio technology as point-to-point communication on the battlefield. So there were lots of people who knew how to use radio technology, but it was very anarchic. It was very sort of scary for governments who thought that they were losing control of the means of communication. And so you begin to see the emergence of regulations and corporations to kind of control that sense of control the new medium, I suppose. And that's where you begin to see the establishment, for example, of the British Broadcasting Company, so they could sell radio sets to people who were listening in the home in a way that was controlled and regulated from the centre.
We also asked Kate, in those early decades before it became entertainment, what kind of role did radio play in people's lives?
I think it begins in the UK in local places, in London, for example, but also a few of the other sort of major cities. So it takes a long time for it to become fully a sort of national broadcaster, if we're talking about the BBC. And it was very early on recognised as being a way of bringing the nation together. And that was partly why they invested in the infrastructure to make sure that everybody could listen in wherever you lived. But it was always about entertainment. Right from the beginning, it was always a mix of entertainment, information, and education. So one of the very first programmes, for example, was the Children's Hour. That came on air really early on, from the early 1920s, for example. Mixture of stories and music and instruction for children and their parents. But there's been music on air and entertainment right from the very beginning. In fact, most of the genres that we think of today, if you think about the chat show, or you think about the quiz show, or you think about soap operas and so on, they're all radio genres. They all have their histories back in the early days of radio broadcasting.
We also spoke to Kate about radio and the use of it during World War I and II. This is how it went.
Well, I think in the First World War, it was really only a military technology. So it was used very much sort of on the battlefield for getting messages across distance between soldiers. It was only really after that, as I say, when the sort of demobbed soldiers came back and started using it for their personal communication. And there was a great excitement about early radio technology, about capturing voices from the air. So there would be a great thrill in receiving voices from as far away as possible, sort of catching these ethereal and disembodied voices from the airwaves. So that's really how it began. I don't think there was very much sort of domestic use of radio technology in any substantial way during that period. And if that answers your question.
It does, yes, thank you. Then what would you say made it grow from a technical tool into a central part of everyday life and culture?
That's a really good question and a very difficult one to answer. I think one way of answering it is there are lots of commercial incentives for people to produce radio sets that they were able to sell to the public. And one thing that they needed to do in order to sell those sets was to produce radio programs that people wanted to listen to. So that's one set of incentives. I've talked a little bit already about the political incentives that there were to sort of bring the nation together in that post-war period. But I think there are also other things going on. So if you're thinking about the early 1920s, there's the trauma of the First World War, but also coming on the back of immense social changes through the industrialization of the 19th century and the move from rural communities into the city, new forms of working practices, the extension of the vote to people, so a new form of democracy emerging. For all of those reasons, radio becomes a really useful technology to bring those people together. So it's a sort of social application of the technology. So it's not somebody deciding that this is what will happen. It's actually just meeting a social need that's already existing through these broader scale technological, political, cultural and social change that are happening through that period.
So through that period, would you say that radio created a sense of unity, comfort, or maybe even manipulation from who were making the radio shows at the time?
I think probably all of those things. I mean, there was a national program, but there were also regional programs. There was also a very middle class sort of version of reality that was being presented. So the Director General of the BBC, through much of that early period, who sort of set the scene for public service broadcasting, believed that it was the duty of the broadcasters to broadcast the best of culture. And they had a very hierarchical notion of what culture meant. But it also was a democratic vision, saying that everybody should have access to the best that culture has to provide. So there's a sort of democratic elitism behind all of this, if you like. So certainly there's one way of looking at that early output that can see it as very elitist, very exclusive and exclusionary. There are lots of voices that are not being heard. You have a sort of BBC English. So there's a kind of marginalization of different kinds of accents and different kinds of communities. But by the same token, there's a sort of democratizing potential that's written into the idea of broadcasting. So the idea that you're speaking to the whole nation on behalf of the whole nation means that more and more people are kind of claiming and struggling to be heard onto the airwaves, and you eventually get more and more people being listened to. I think the other really interesting thing that happens is because of the way that broadcasting is set up as a domestic medium, so most people are listening to radio mostly in the home, it means that the broadcasters have to learn a sort of very familiar way of speaking. So public speaking up until the introduction of radio had been very formal or had been very loud, people standing up on soapboxes in public places and so on. This was them having to recognise that they needed to adapt public speech to the conditions of the home, which meant speaking in more of a vernacular, more of a sort of everyday way. And that really changes the relationship that politicians, for example, have with the public. So now we think nothing of there being a sort of interaction. There's much less deference in the public space. And part of that, you could argue, is because of the legacy of those early decisions of the broadcasters back in the 1920s and 30s, as they were learning to speak in a more everyday public way.
With that in mind, what would you say were the main differences on how radio was used in the First World War compared to the Second World War?
Well, by the Second World War, the radio had really become a mass medium. It had really reached into many people's homes and many people's lives. And even if people didn't have a radio set themselves, they would know about radio and they'd be listening to radio at their neighbours or in school or whatever. So it's very much a part of the everyday furniture, literally, but also the everyday sort of culture. And it becomes an absolutely crucial vehicle for people to find out what's happening in the war. So the BBC builds its reputation through ostensibly being very honest about the war, so talking about losses as well as gains. So it wasn't propaganda in a sort of straightforward sense. It was much more about keeping morale up and getting the population to buy into the sort of national project of fighting Germany. So I think there's two things. It was about information, but it was also about comfort. So there's lots of programs which are for distraction, for morale boosting, for keeping people in contact with each other. So lots of programs about trying to join up the home front with the battlefront and so on, with request shows and such like. So the war is really the point at which the BBC both wins its reputation for being an impartial arbiter of news, but also as being a space of connection and national identity, if you like.
After the Second World War, TV quickly began to dominate over the radio, and then became the primary source of entertainment by the 1950s.
Only a few thousand American homes had TVs, but after the war, in 1952, that number jumped to 12 million, and just 3 years later, half the US had televisions in their homes.
But radio didn't disappear. To find out more, we again talked to Kate about how radio has adapted and survived.
You also asked about how radio survives. So it survives partly through habit, but also partly by just adapting to different kinds of specialisms. So So media like radio, they don't disappear. They just adapt to the new environment. So radio becomes much more important in the mornings, where people haven't got time to sit. Well, they weren't broadcasting television in the mornings to begin with, but also later on, where people are sort of, generally speaking about the population, are sort of getting ready for school and work and so on. They're not sitting down to watch television. So radio becomes a really important space in the mornings when you're getting ready to go out, as a sort of accompaniment for that, or an accompaniment late at night for people sort of winding down and so on, or an accompaniment in the car. So it becomes, it adapts to different uses. But you can see now, even now with the sort of popularity of podcasting and so on, that idea of radio as a secondary medium, something that you can listen to while doing something else, is one of the major reasons why radio not only survives, but thrives throughout the entire period. It's not that people stopped listening to the radio. They just they just watched and listened to television as well.
We also talked to Martin Spinelli, the UK's first professor of podcasting, who teaches at the University of Sussex. We asked him about his thoughts on podcasting and how it can be different from radio. Let's hear about how that conversation went.
Often radio has been described as an intimate medium. How do you think that intimacy compares to other forms of media, such as TV or print?
There have been loads of studies over the decades that have shown that the relationships that we form through listening alone, as opposed to listening and seeing, the relationships we form with people that we hear and characters that we hear are stronger and more profound and more memorable than the ones we form through seeing primarily and then listening. So radio was a very intimate medium from very early on, and this was a part of the appeal that it had to politicians. I'm thinking of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the US in the 1930s, but also during the Second World War, in terms of politicians doing propaganda on radio from all sides. They knew that they could make a stronger connection with an audience through the ear than they could with most other means, and they really leaned into that and worked to exploit that as much as possible. In more recent years, podcasting has come along, really broke onto the popular scene about 10 or 12 years ago. And that made even better use of intimacy, was even more intimate as an experience, largely because people were listening initially, and I believe continue to still listen today, to podcasts on earbuds more than on any other device, more than on a smart speaker, more than on car stereo speakers. And there's something about the earbuds that are actually inside your ear. They're inside the human body. They're inside you. That is really intimate. I'm listening to your voice inside my own body. And that is something that other kinds of speaker monitor listening don't afford, or even open headphones like the kinds that you're wearing don't afford, as well as having something literally in your ear.
Now that you mentioned podcasting, what are the strengths that radio still has over digital platforms and vice versa?
Well, I think certainly radio is much, much better for live event coverage. I don't think anybody would argue anything other than that. Radio does the live, does the immediate much, much better than podcasting. Yes, you have some podcasts that are experimenting with things like YouTube Live and stuff where they're even taking phone calls and trying to respond instantaneously. But at least at the moment, that's not how the vast majority of people use podcasting, and that's what we use radio for. So breaking news coverage of events and disasters, live sports coverage. I don't think podcasting is probably ever going to replace radio in terms of live sports coverage. Phone-in political conversation where you're actually having real dialogue with lots of people in your listening community, and those people are calling up in real time, commenting on the last person that called. These feel to me like they are traits of radio, and yeah, you could certainly call them advantages. I think radio does that and will continue to do that better than podcasting.
You've been called the UK's first professor of podcasting. What does that title mean for you, and what does it say about how podcasting is now being recognized today?
I'm very proud of that title. I'm very proud to be called Professor of Podcasting. I'm honored that the University of Sussex made me the Professor of Podcasting. Certainly, as far as we could tell, the first Professor of Podcasting in the UK. We also haven't been able to find any others in Europe either. So potentially also in Europe. And I'm very, very proud of that. I like being able to say that to people because it's interesting and people think, oh, that's odd and quirky. But I also like it for the fact that podcasting is now being taken seriously in the same sphere as film or TV or the web. I mean, it's very common to find film professors, for example. Why shouldn't we also have podcasting professors? So I think it's well past time that the medium of podcasting was recognized as something as substantial and significant as, say, film has been recognized.
So far, we've heard how radio has begun and how it's evolving, but what sort of impact is it having on communities?
To figure this out, we spoke to David Cunningham, the Group Operations Director at Total Sense Media. They locally own media brands such as More Radio Sussex, Isle of Wight Radio, and more.
We first asked him if he thinks radio stations having a connection with the community is important. Let's hear how it went.
Do you think it's important to have a connection with your community in that aspect?
Yeah, very much so. If we go back to my early days in radio, in commercial radio, my origins were in forming what was Splash FM that launched in Worthing in May 2003. And we did an awful lot of things, one of which we still do to this very day, which is sort of, if I describe it to you as a party in the park type of event, which I did as a free event for people to go to when we were applying for the license back in 2002. And we put live bands on, and people came along and had a great evening. And that's something that we do, albeit under the limitations of how much it's grown as an event and the costs involved. We do now have to make a charge for the event, but the origin to that event was as a community event. So I remember very well the reason to connect with the audience was to get them behind the radio station, and from that we did things where we would do auctions and appeals to raise funds. We still do that sort of thing. We've got one running at the moment on More Radio, which is called 10,000 Tins, which we've got a variety of partners right there across the east and west Sussex who have got drop bins in supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's and others, and people are donating an extra can, they're buying some extra beans or whatever it might be, soup, etc., and dropping them in. And then we're partnering up with FareShare, who are getting them to to places that distribute them to people who aren't managing to fund their family to make sure they get a square meal every day. So we do things like that now. We do awards as well to this day. We've just recently done at Hickstead in near Eastbourne. We've just done the Child of Sussex Awards for this year, where we celebrate people that perhaps have had adversity in their life, often health and sometimes life-limiting conditions with young people, and we celebrate them by putting an event on, they win an award, and they obviously get some publicity, have a lovely evening out with us, and we feed them and supply them with drinks for them and their families to come out and champion these people. So yes, so we've still certainly got a community spirit, but we do have to balance that as a business that has significant costs to operate, that we have to consider how much of our time we can invest and how much of our resources we can give away to do these sort of things, and we have to obviously charge businesses for advertising on the radio. It is a balancing act.
And do you think the way you are interacting with your community has changed, like, I don't know, from the past?
Yeah, I mean, in the old days, people used to communicate with the radio station either by phoning you up and having a chat. You'd open the phone lines, people would call, and maybe you'd talk to them on the air, or even just talk to them off the air, depending on what it was about, really. And you get letters written into the radio station. Neither of those are particularly popular mediums now. Social media has become the prevalent way to interact, particularly Facebook, but some of the other platforms as well. But that's probably the number one interaction is Facebook. But we've got short code SMS, a text number, and for certain competitions that we do, we engage people through that and call them back. So the interaction's very, very electronic now, as opposed to in the old days before people had mobile phones. It was done quite differently. But there is still interaction on a daily basis, which has got to be a good thing.
So, we've looked into where radio has come from and what it looks like today, but where is it going?
We again talked to Martin and Kate about what the future of radio industry might look like. Here's what they had to say.
How do you think that emerging technologies like AI, immersive audio, or interactive podcasts might change the way we listen and produce?
AI is going to change the way we produce everything, not just podcasting. So I think in AI, there are companies now that are producing AI-only podcasts where they're just producing 3,000 episodes a week. Literally, that's a real thing. I think the company's name is Elysium. Anyway, and it's AI voices and AI generated scripts around topics. And the idea is to produce a tremendous volume of AI slop and pick up listeners wherever you can on the algorithms. And you're going to use your search engine optimization techniques, your algorithm optimization techniques to get those podcasts noticed. People are going to listen, and they may listen for the information. They're not really going to listen for intimate reasons. They're not going to listen to kind of develop relationships with the hosts. Certainly not if they're healthy. They won't be doing that. So I think the production tools, and Lance have played around with these, are here already, and we are teaching our students how to use them. Descript is a really good one that I teach my students how to use. A really, really great way of using text editing tools to edit audio. So rather than editing a visual waveform on something like Pro Tools or Reaper or Adobe Audition or Audacity, you're actually just working with a transcript, and you're moving bits of words around in the transcript, and that is simultaneously moving the audio around. There are lots of voice generating bits of AI. So a very fun one that came out, I don't know, about a year ago or 9 months ago, was Google Notebooks LM, where you can upload a bunch of documents and ask it to generate a 10-minute podcast episode, and you get a two-handed conversational podcast based on the text that you uploaded. And it's, you could tweak it and direct it and tell it to focus on this rather than that. So I think in terms of listening, I think the AI impact on listening is at the moment happening behind the scenes, and it's happening at the level of the algorithms. So the algorithms are using a tremendous amount of AI to get us hooked on listening to things, get us to keep listening. So I think that AI probably before too long will be used to help people curate their own podcast listening feeds, playlists, if you will. But at the moment, it's the heart of those algorithms that feed us the content that the maths say we're going to like.
Well, looking ahead, how do you think the new technologies like artificial intelligence, algorithms, or smart speakers will shape the future of radio and listening?
I think they're already shaping it. I mean, a lot of, I'm talking about music radio and so on, a lot of the selection of playlists and so on that are happening already on a lot of the mainstream radio stations, that's already AI generated. There are AI DJs. There are people listening to voices that are artificially generated already around the world. I mean, there's the same arguments and debates about what's happening to creativity and jobs in the creative sector are as much a part of the radio podcasting landscape as they are the film and TV sort of landscape. So I think that the future in a way is already here. I mean, I think the other way of thinking about it is that radio, being such an adaptable and resilient medium, I mean, because all we're talking about is the use of sound without image, I suppose, to communicate with people over distance and time. It's going to adapt to the new technologies in the same way that it adapted to the introduction of the internet or to the introduction of television, or, you know, before that, you know, it's the way it connected with the media environment when it first emerged. So I think it's going to change, but it's always changed. You know, it would be very odd if it stopped changing.
From everything we've just heard, radio is always changing, and it will likely continue to in the future, especially with the advancements in technology like AI.
We asked the experts if they had any advice for future creators who would be interested in working in the industry. Here's what Gabrielle asked them.
What skills do you think young media creators should focus on if they want to work in radio or podcasting today?
Story. That's it. That's the most important thing. You need to be able to tell a good story. Anyone can learn how to use the software. AI is making software use less and less important. The thing AI is never really going to be able to do is to really tell good, compelling, interesting stories. So you really need to brush up your story skills if you want to work in media. So I tell people who are about your age, who are coming to open days at the University of Sussex, and they ask me, you know, what should I do on my personal statement? Well, like, the thing that I tell them is, you want to write a personal statement that is the story of your evolution as a media producer from when you first started playing with Canva or whatever social media tools when you were 12, up to you getting a degree in media production and you getting a job for Disney or for the BBC or for Goalhanger podcasts. So you need to tell the story of your life that has a dramatic arc to it, where challenges are overcome and revelations are had, learning and growth happens, and the final chapter of that is you graduating from a degree and getting a job that you want, or producing the thing that you want to produce. So I think the most important thing that I would like young people to come to me with as a professor is an ability to tell good stories and an ability to identify stories.
From everything we've heard today, radio has shaped how we communicate, learn, and share stories for more than a century. We've seen its origins, the importance during war, its adaptation to the rise of television, and the reinvention through podcasting.
As we've heard from the experts, radio is likely to continue to evolve. With special thanks to Professor Kate Lacey, Professor Martin Spillane, and David Cunningham for sharing their insights.
Music featured includes 1940s oldies music at Vintage Manor House by Retro Sleep from youtube.com. Romantic by Benjamin Tissot from bensound.com.
Backed Vibes by Kevin MacLeod. Puzzle Pieces by Albert Bahar. Ran by Walls. Tunnels by Daniel Zambo. And Rio in the 70s by Nicholas Kluzek, all from Upbeat.io.
The Rise of Radio was produced, edited and presented by me, Gabriel Caro Meneses.
By me, Matthew Robertson.
And by me, Tristan Gaston. Thank you for listening to The Rise of Radio.